It all began when the HOA decided to hit us with a fine that made absolutely no sense at all. A whopping $675 over something so small that it almost felt like they were inventing reasons to collect money. The letter showed up in our mailbox with the usual threatening language, acting like we had committed some kind of crime against the community just because they spotted something they didn't like. It wasn't about property damage or anything major, just one of those nitpicky rules that HOA boards love to enforce when they want to show their power. My wife and I looked at the notice in disbelief because the amount was completely disproportionate to the so-called violation, and it was obvious that someone on the board was pushing this personal agenda. The number itself wasn't random either. It felt carefully chosen, not too low to be shrugged off, and not too high to be immediately challenged in court, but just enough to pressure homeowners into paying without questioning. That's how HOAs operate, through intimidation letters and outrageous fines, making you feel like you have no choice but to comply with whatever they throw at you. When my wife read that notice, she didn't react the way the HOA expected. Instead of panicking or reaching for a checkbook, she stayed calm and firm, as if she had been preparing for this kind of nonsense all along. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of her, read it word for word, and simply shook her head, almost amused by how far they were willing to go. She knew right away that paying this fine would only encourage them to keep inventing more reasons to demand money. And she wasn't about to let that cycle begin. She placed the notice back in the envelope and set it aside, making it clear that it wasn't going to control her day or her mood. Whenever HOA Karen would walk by our house and give her little glares, my wife didn't flinch or look away. She just carried on watering her plants or sitting on the porch, completely unbothered. It was her quiet confidence that unsettled the board the most, because they were used to homeowners giving in quickly. And here she was, refusing to play their game, refusing to hand over money she didn't owe, and refusing to let intimidation work. That calm refusal was like pouring gasoline on a fire, because HOA Karen couldn't handle being ignored. She thrived on control, on seeing people bend under the weight of her so-called authority. And when my wife didn't, it drove her absolutely crazy. Instead of letting it go or bringing the issue up in a professional way, she decided to take the most dramatic and unnecessary step possible. She picked up the phone and called the cops. To her, this wasn't about enforcing a rule anymore. It was about making a scene, about showing the entire neighborhood that she had the power to drag law enforcement into something as trivial as a fine. She wanted flashing lights, uniforms, and the weight of authority on her side to scare us into submission. You could almost see her excitement building when she stood outside with her arms crossed, waiting for the patrol car to arrive. She wanted neighbors to peek through their blinds and whisper about how the troublemakers on the block were finally getting dealt with. To her, this was the ultimate weapon: humiliation and intimidation wrapped up in one phone call that she believed would force us to cave instantly. When the sheriff finally pulled up, the atmosphere shifted immediately, and the little neighborhood drama suddenly felt like a full-blown standoff. The patrol car rolled in slowly, lights flickering just enough to draw attention, and neighbors started peeking out from their porches and windows to see what was going on. Karen straightened up like she was the one in charge, ready to point fingers and deliver her side of the story first. But the sheriff didn't rush. He stepped out calmly, taking in the scene with that steady, measured presence that law enforcement officers carry. He walked over, introduced himself, and asked what the issue was, not taking anyone's word at face value. Karen jumped right in, waving her arms, holding up the fine notice, and insisting that we were in violation and refusing to comply. The sheriff listened, nodding, then turned his attention to us, wanting to hear our version without interruption. My wife handed him the letter and calmly explained how it was baseless, how this wasn't a criminal matter, but just another example of the HOA overstepping. The sheriff didn't raise his voice or show frustration. But you could tell he was already realizing that this call wasn't exactly the emergency Karen wanted it. Tobikarin was practically bouncing on her heels, certain that the sheriff would back her up without question. She kept pointing at the notice, repeating the amount of the fine like it was some kind of legal charge that carried the weight of a court order. She demanded that the sheriff do something about our refusal, her voice sharp and impatient as though she were the one giving him instructions. But instead of jumping in to enforce her demands, the sheriff paused and asked her for something very specific. He wanted to see the official HOA orders that gave her the authority to involve law enforcement in the first place. The question stopped her mid-sentence because it was clear she hadn't expected him to challenge her. She fumbled with her binder full of HOA papers, flipping through pages that had nothing to do with the situation, hoping she could find something that sounded official enough to pass off. The sheriff stood there calmly, waiting, making no move to escalate the situation until she produced what he had asked for. It was the first time anyone had actually questioned her authority in front of others. And the pressure was written all over her face, Karen's. Confidence cracked in an instant when she realized she didn't have the documents the sheriff was asking for. All her bluster and loud demands suddenly didn't matter, because without real authority behind her words, she was just a neighbor with a stack of papers that held no legal weight. She tried to argue, insisting that as an HOA board member, she didn't need to prove anything. But the sheriff didn't let her dodge the question. He stayed calm but firm, repeating that unless she could provide actual orders or legal documentation, this was nothing more than a civil dispute, not a police matter. The more he pressed, the more flustered she became, her voice losing its sharpness as her words stumbled over each other. Neighbors watching from their porches could see the shift clearly. The woman, who always acted untouchable, was suddenly exposed. She had called the cops expecting to put us in our place, but now she was the one on the defensive, cornered by her own lack of authority. My wife didn't have to raise her voice or argue. She just stood there quietly while the sheriff's simple request stripped away Karen's illusion of control in front of everyone.